In today's video, we're going to build the game Battleship. We're going to build a single player version, a multiplayer version, and then style it with animations. Now, I'm not going to be doing all of this myself. I've actually combined forces with Ania Kubów and Kyle from Web Dev Simplified. Ania is going to be doing the single player version, and then I'll be taking her code and adding the multiplayer client and server side game logic. It's thundering outside. I don't know if you can hear that. And then I'll send it to Kyle at Web Dev Simplified, where he'll style it and make it awesome. When we're done with it, you're actually going to be able to go online and play this game at battleship.tech. We'll be using Node.js with Express, Socketio, and we'll deploy it on Heroku. So again, this is the second video in a three-part collaboration with Ania Kubów and Kyle at Web Dev Simplified. So if you haven't watched the first video yet, go to Ania's channel and watch that one first, because I'll be starting with her code today. Then after this video, go to Web Dev Simplified to see the final product. Links to both are in the description below. So let's get straight into it. So I have Ania's final code here from her video, which she did an amazing job on. Let's quickly run through this and see how it works. So let's open this up in live server. You can see here that right away the computer randomly places its ships. So now we can place our ships, pull them up here, and we can rotate them if we want. And once we get all of our ships placed, then we can start our game and start firing. So we can come over here and fire. And when we get a hit, it turns red. If we get a miss, it turns black. And we can see that after we fire, then the computer fires. And of course, we can see the enemy ships here, so it's kind of easy, but you get the idea. And then we can see whose go it is. So as soon as we click it, it says computers go, and then it goes back to your go. And then when we sink a ship, we see the status here, you sunk the computer's cruiser. So all of the basic functionality is here. Let's now make it multiplayer. So let's go back into VS Code. And now you will need to have Node.js installed on your system. So let's open up the terminal. The first thing that we'll do is npm init y. And that's going to create this package.json for us. And then we're going to install a couple of things. So we're going to say npm I express and Socketio. It's going to take a few seconds for that to install. And then one more thing we're going to install is npm I. It's going to be -- save dev and nodemon. So this is going to monitor our node server, and any changes that we make, it's going to automatically restart it for us. And that's only going to be in development. So next we're going to create a public folder, and we're going to move the client-side files into there. So that's the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript that Ania created. So we'll move that into there. Next, let's edit a couple of things in our package.json. So name Battleships, that's fine. Description, we'll say multiplayer battleship game. All right, and then our main is going to be a server.js. We're going to create that in just a second. And then we need to create a couple of scripts. So we're going to create a start. And on start, we want to node server. So that's going to start our production server. We're also going to have a dev, which is going to start our development server. So that's going to be nodemon server. All right, we'll save that and we're done with that. Now let's create our server.js. So we'll create a new file in the root, server.js. We'll close the terminal for now. So now we want to pull in a few things that we're going to need. So we'll say const express equals require express. All right, and then we'll say const path is going to equal require, and then path. And then const HTTP is going to equal require HTTP. And then we're going to get a port. Port is going to equal process.env.port or 3000. So we're actually not going to create an env file in our project here, but once we deploy this to Heroku, we can then set a port. So in development, it's going to be 3000. And then in production, we can choose to change that if we want. Next, we're also going to need Socketio. We'll say Socketio equals require, and then Socketio. Now we'll create our app. So we'll say const app equals express, and then we'll say const server equals http.createServer, and then we'll pass it app. And lastly, we're going to say const io equals Socketio, and then pass it server. Okay, so we're getting express. We need path because we're going to use that in just a minute. We needed HTTP so that we could create this server with our express app. And then we pass this server into Socketio. All right, so now we're going to set our static folder. So this is the folder that our server is going to serve to the client. So that's going to be our public folder. That's where all of our game files are. So we're going to say, let's say set static folder. And then here we'll say app.use express.static. And then we're going to pass it our path.join. And then that's going to be dir name and then public. All right, so we're creating that static folder that we're going to then serve to the client. So now we can start the server. So let's say start server. And to do that, we'll say server.listen. We're going to pass it our port and then an arrow function. And let's just console log. We'll do a template string here and we'll say server running on port, and we'll pass in the port. So let's save that and we'll open up the console again. And let's just clear that out and we'll say npm run dev. So there we go. Server is running on port 3000. So because this is development and we have nodemon running, if we make a change, then it's going to automatically restart the server for us. So if we change this port, let's just change it to 4000 and we'll save it. You'll see that it restarted automatically and now it's on port 4000. All right, so we're just going to change that back to 3000, save it. And now if we go to localhost port 3000, we should see the game that Ania created. So this was from before. Let's just change this to 3000. And there we go. So now it's time to start configuring Socketio. So let's close our terminal. So after this, let's just say handle a socket connection request from web client. Then in here, we're going to say io.on connection socket arrow function. And just for now, we're just going to console log new WebSocket connection. Okay. So IO is our Socketio server. And we're going to say on connection. So it's listening for this connection. On connection, we have a socket. A socket is the actual client that is connecting. So for now, we're just going to console log that we have a connection. So in order to even get a connection, we're going to have to make some modifications to the public files. So in our index.html, we're going to add another script. So right here, we're going to say script, and the source is going to be /socketio/socket.io.js. All right, so let's save that. And then we're also going to go into our app.js in the app here. And then let's just go right after this. And let's just add a const of socket equals io. So io is going to come out of the script that we loaded before. So let's save that. Now we'll go back to our local host, which was on port 3000. It should still be running. I'm just going to move this over. Let me open up the terminal. So now when I refresh, we should see an indication that we've connected. And there we go, new WebSocket connection. So now that we're connecting, let's assign that connection so that we can keep track of it. And we're only going to keep track of 2 players. So if a third player connects, they're going to have to either wait or play in single player mode. All right, so let's close the terminal and let's go back to our server.js. So we're going to add another const here, and let's say connections. It's going to equal an array of null and null. So that's our 2 connections that we're going to keep track of. Anything after the first 2, we're just going to ignore. All right, so for now, let's just comment that out. We're not going to console log that anymore. So now let's say find an available player number. All right, so in here, we're going to say let player index equal -1. So we're going to start at a -1, and we'll say for const I in connections. We're just going to loop through our 2 connections that we have here that are initially null. And so then we'll say if connections I equals null, then scroll down a little bit here. Then we'll say player index equals I, and then break. Okay, so we're going to loop through. On the first time through, it's going to be 0. Index is going to be 0. So we'll say connections 0. Is that equal null? If it does equal null, then player index is going to be 0. And then we want to break because we don't want to move on to the next connection in the loop. We've already found one and we just need to break. If none of these are null and we already have 2 connections, then it's not going to do anything. Player index will remain -1. So that's how we can track to see if we have too many players. And then after this, we could say ignore player 3, and then we'll say if player index equals -1, then return. So we're not going to do anything else if at this point in time player index is still -1. So then once we get past that, then we could say, we'll say tell the connecting client what player number they are. All right, and then we'll say socket.emit player number, and then player index. And then let's just console log player, and then player index has connected. All right, so socket.emit is going to tell the connecting socket what player number they are. So think of this as like a message, almost like an email. You have a title and then you have a body. So the title is going to be what the client is going to look for. So we're sending a message, and this is the title of the message, player number. And this is the data for the message or the body. So now we can do something with this index on the client side. So let's look at this in action. Let's open up the terminal. And now we can see that we just restarted the server, and I already had the client in the browser connected. So now we're seeing player 0 has connected. So if I go back up here and just hit save again, you're going to see it's restarting and then player 0 connected because the browser is still open and it's still connected to port 3000. All right, so now we can go into our app.js and we can use Socketio to listen for that player number being transmitted to us. So there are a few things we need to add on here. So let's say, so we're going to need to keep track of the game mode. So let's say game mode equals initially nothing. And then we'll say let player number equals 0. So we'll just assume that we are player 0 until we're told otherwise. We'll say let ready equal false. So we need to keep track of whether the player is ready or not. And then enemy ready. We also need to know if the enemy is ready. And then we're also going to keep track of all ships placed. And that's going to equal false initially. We don't want people to cheat by not placing all of their ships before they start the game. So we'll keep track of that. And then lastly, we're going to keep track of shot fired. And initially that's going to be -1. All right, so then after this socket here, we could say, let's comment this and say, get your player number. So we'll say socket dot on. So we're listening for player number. That's the title of the message. We're listening for a transmission that is titled player number. And then we're going to get the data from that. So that was the number. So we'll say num of an arrow function here. So we'll say if num equals -1, then we're going to info display. That's our status, right? So enter HTML is going to equal, sorry, the server is full. So if our player number is -1, still that means that the server is already full, and we just need to let them know that the server is full. Actually, if we go back to the server, I think I put this in the wrong spot, because if our -1, then we're stopping here. So actually, let's move that. It needs to go just past this. We still want to let the player know, even if they're player 3, 4, 5, or so on, we still want to let them know that the server is full. All right, so let's save that. We'll go back here and we'll finish this out. So if we're not player -1, then we'll say else player num equals parse int num. The data being transmitted to us from Socketio is a string, and we just want to make sure that we parse that into a number. And then we're going to say if player num equals 1, then we're going to set our current player to equal enemy. Okay, so we're going to be given a number, and it's either going to be 0 or 1. 0 would be player 1, and 1 would be player 2. So we're deciding ahead of time that player 0 is always going to start first. So if we go up here, current player is user, right? So player 0 is going to be user, and player 1 is going to be enemy. And after this, let's just console log player num so we can see what we're getting. All right, so let's test this out. We'll save that. Let's pull up the terminal so we can see these connections. And then we'll pull up our board here and let's restart. So we got 0 connected. Let's pull up our terminal and we have 0. So player 0 connected and the server told the client that they were player 0. Okay, so before we go too much further, we need to make some minor changes to the HTML. So at the top of the HTML, we're going to add a few things here. We're going to add a button, and that's going to have an ID of single player button, and we'll just say single player. And then we're going to create another button with the ID of multiplayer button. And we'll say multiplayer. Okay, and then after that, we're going to create a div with the class of player and p1 for player 1. Within that, we'll say player 1. And then we're going to have a div with the class of connected. And within that, we'll say connected. And then we're going to have a span inside of it. And then after that, we'll have a div with the class of ready. And within that, we'll say ready and then a span inside that. And then we'll take all of this, Alt, Shift, down arrow, duplicate it, and let's change player 1 to player 2. And everything else will be the same, except for this. We'll change that to player 2 there. All right, so then we'll save that and go back into our app.js. We need to add these buttons in here. So let's go right here. We'll say const single player button equals document dot query selector, and then we'll pass in single player button All right, and let's just Alt-Shift down arrow, duplicate that. And we're going to change single player button to multiplayer button. All right, and then just down here, we're going to create some event listeners for those clicks. So let's say select player mode. So we'll say single player button dot add event listener, click, and then we'll say start single player. And we're going to create that function in just a minute. And then let's just Alt-Shift down arrow, change this to multiplayer button, and then start multiplayer. So now we need to create these functions here. So let's go ahead and encapsulate all of the single player functions into a single player function. So let's go down just below this. And so we'll say, here's our single player, say function start single player. And within this, we're going to set our game mode. It's going to equal single player. And then we're going to move a few things into here. So we don't need to look at this ships array. Let's make that smaller. Generate ship. We're not going to do anything there. Okay, so generate ship. This right here is where the computer randomly places its ships. So we only want to do that in single player mode. So we're going to cut those and we're going to put them up here into this function. And then our other thing is our start button. Let's find that. All right, so right here we have this, this start button. We're going to move this up to our single player right here. So when we start single player, we're going to add the event listener on click and it's going to go to play game. And we're actually going to change this to play game single. So we're going to rename this. And an easy way to do it, instead of searching all over and trying to find all of the places where it says play game, just right here, put your cursor on it and hit F2. It allows us to easily change it. So we're going to say play game single. And it just changed it everywhere. So if I highlight this, we can see we have another instance here. Here's the main instance of it. Just a minute ago, it said play game. Now it says play game single. All right, so now we can get back to some more Socketio stuff. So let's create a start multiplayer function. So we'll go back up to the top here. Here's the single player. So let's just go right here. We'll say multiplayer. We'll say function start multiplayer. Within this, we need to set our game mode. That's going to equal multiplayer. And then we're going to move this other stuff. So we only want to use our socket when we're in multiplayer mode. We don't initially want that there. Let's just tidy this up a little bit. Okay, so if we select multiplayer, then we'll go in here and set our game mode, and we'll start our socket connection, and we'll listen for our player number. So now let's go back into our server. We want to let other players know when another player connects. So after we have ignore player 3, this is where we are going to set our connections. So we're going to say connections and then player index. So we know now that we have a player index that's not -1. So we're going to set it to false. So it was null, and now we're going to set it to false because we're going to keep track of whether the player is ready or not. So initially the player is not going to be ready. And now we're going to tell everyone what player number just connected. All right, so we'll say socket.broadcast.emit and then player connection, and we'll send it the player index. Okay, so up here we do socket.emit. That only communicates directly to the socket that connected. Socket.broadcast.emit tells everybody else whatever it is you want to tell them. So we're going to send the title or the topic of player connection, and then we're going to send the data of the player index. All right, so now back in the app.js, let's receive that message. So we'll go right after the player number. We'll say another player has connected or disconnected. Right, so then let's say socket.on. So we're listening for player connection. And then we have a number being passed to us. So we'll have an arrow function. And then within that, we'll say, for now, we'll just do console log. And then player number. And we'll pass that in as connected or disconnected. Okay, so now let's save that and then open up the terminal and we can see the connections here. And then we'll go over to our app here and let's refresh. So here's the buttons that we added and then our statuses, which we'll get to that a little bit later. But now we're not getting anything initially because we need to choose whether we're in single or multiplayer mode. So let's go ahead and hit multiplayer. And now we see that we are player 0 and player 0 has connected. So let's open up another browser and connect to localhost 3000. And then we'll pull up the console on here as well. And if we hit multiplayer, now we see player 1 has connected and we are player 1. Now we want to be able to visually see these connections. So that's where these statuses here come into play. So let's go back into our app.js, close the terminal for now. So here on player connection, we also want to add, after this, we're going to add player connected or disconnected, and then pass in the number. All right, so we're going to create this function here. All right, so we'll create that function here. We're passing it a number. And then within the function, we're going to say let player equal, and we'll use a template literal, and we're going to pass it the number, but we need to parse it. So we'll say parseInt num, and then we're going to add to that 1. So what we're going to do here is we're basically looking for the class. So remember back in here in the HTML, we have this P1 and this P2 class. So we're trying to get access to that. So P, and then we're looking for either a 1 or a 2. Now we're going to get 0 or 1 because it's using index initially, right? So player 0 is actually player 1 is actually player 2. So we're going to add a 1 to it in order to get the proper number. So then after that, we're going to say document.querySelector, and then we're going to pass into this a template string, player, and then .connected and span. After that, we're going to say ClassList.toggle, and then green. Okay, so we're getting a query selector and we're passing in a player, which player is going to be either .p1 or 2, and then .connected span. So we'll go back into here again. If it's p1, then it's going to get this div here of connected, and then the span within it. And we want to turn this into a green box or a red box. So in order to do that, we are actually going to have to add a little bit more CSS, not a whole lot, but let's go into the CSS. We'll go all the way to the bottom. And then let's just add a couple of things in here. So we'll say .connected and .ready. We're going to have a ready as well. So both of these, we're going to set the font weight to normal initially. You'll see why we're going to change that. And then we'll say .connected span and .ready span. We're going to display these inline block. And then we're going to set the width to 1 rem, and the height is going to be 1 rem. and the background is going to be red. So initially we're not going to be connected and we're not going to be ready. So those will be red until we change them. So we change them by saying span.green background green. All right, so let's save that and we can close that. We're not going to be doing any more CSS. And there's one more thing that we want to add in here. We're going to say if parseInt num equals player num. So if the player that is connecting is actually us, then we want to document.querySelector, and then within that we're going to pass in our player, and then .style font weight, and that is going to equal bold. So if the player connecting is actually us, then we're going to change the font weight to bold so that we can have an indicator as to which player we are. So let's save that and take a look. We'll go back to our app and let's refresh this. So now we have our red squares. Oh, app.js 58. I'm missing something here. What am I missing? Oh, I didn't declare this as a function. Wow. Okay, let's save that now. Okay, so let's refresh. And then we're going to refresh both of these and then connect. So player 0 has connected. And then if we come over here and we connect, player 1 has connected. Now we'll go back to player 0 and we can see that this has turned green. Okay, so now let's handle disconnections. So if someone were to disconnect, we need to be able to handle that. We'll go back to the server.js. And then just after this, we'll say handle disconnect. So we'll say socket.on disconnect. So that's going to be a function. And we'll just say console log player, and then we'll pass in that player index disconnected. All right, then after that, we need to handle it. So let's say connections and then player index. We need to set that connection back to null. And then we're going to tell everyone what player number just disconnected. Right, so we'll say socket.broadcast.emit. We'll say player connection, and then pass the player index. We're already listening for the player connection on the client. So when the disconnection happens, we can see that status go from green to red. Let's save that and we'll go back to our app and let's refresh both of these. And then we'll connect. So there's player 0 and then there's player 1. And we go back over here, we'll see that player 1, which is actually player 2, is connected. And now if we go back to player 2 and we refresh, so that's going to disconnect us, we can see that it's now red. And if we pull up our console here, we'll see that we had 0 connected, 1 connected, and then 1 disconnected. So now let's handle the ready button. So let's go back into our app.js. Let's just add it right here. We can say ready button click. So we'll say start button dot add event listener click, and then that's going to be an arrow function, and we're going to say play game multi, and then we're going to pass the socket into that function. So of course we need to create that function. We also want to make sure that all of the ships get placed before the player says that he's ready. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to place any ships and you would most likely win. So we already have a variable that we defined at the top here called all ships placed, and it's set to false. So we need to update that somehow. And we're going to do that in our drag drop. So let's find that. Drag drop. All right, so drag drop. So that's when we're placing our ships and we drop it into our game board. So what we're going to do down here is we're going to, so right here at the end, we'll say if not display grid dot query selector and then dot ship, then we'll set all ships placed equals true. Okay, so we're looking in our display grid, which let's go back to the app. Display grid is right here. This is where your ships start from. And as you place them, they are removed from this grid. So we're going to say if the display grid does not have any ships, right? Then we'll set all ships placed to true. Now let's go back up to our event listener. So before this, let's say if all ships placed, then play game multi, else let's do an info display dot inner HTML, and we'll make that equal to please place all ships. All right, let's test that out. Let's save that and we'll go back to our app. Let's refresh and we need to connect. Now we're player 0. And now if we try to hit start game, please place all of your ships. So let's go ahead and place all of the ships. And then I'll hit start game, and play game multi is not defined. That's because that's what we need to do next. All right, so now let's add our logic for the multiplayer. So play game single is here. This is the game logic for single player. And we'll just add right here, game logic for multiplayer. And we'll say function play game multi. And then we're passing into this a socket. We'll say very similar game logic to this one. So we'll say if is game over. We're going to return if not ready. Then we want to socket.emit player ready. So we're going to let the others know that the player is ready, and we'll handle that on the server in just a minute. We're going to set our local ready to equal true. And then we're going to call a function that we're going to create called player ready. And we're going to pass in our player number. So this player ready is going to visually indicate that we're ready. It's going to change the red box to a green box. So let's create that function next. Let's go here. We'll say function player ready. And we'll pass in the number. And we'll say player equals, and we're going to do kind of the same thing, selecting that class, that player class. So we'll say parse int, the number, and then we need to add 1. After that, we'll say document.query selector, and then we'll pass in that player, and then .ready and span. After that, we'll do class list .toggle, and then green, just like we did before. This time it's on the ready span instead of the connection span. All right, so now let's save that, go back to our server, and we need to listen for that player ready. So right after this, we could say on ready. So socket.on, and then player ready. And then we'll have an arrow function. And then socket.broadcast.emit enemy ready. All right. And then we're going to pass our player index. And then after that, we'll say connections. And then player index, and we'll set that to true. Okay, so what we're going to do, the player has announced that he's ready, and we're listening for that on the server. So the server hears player ready. So it's going to then broadcast to the other players that an enemy is ready. and which player index that enemy is. And then we're going to set our local connections that we're keeping track of to true. It was false before because the player was not ready. Now the player is ready, so it's set to true. All right, so now we need to handle the listener for enemy ready on the client side. Let's save this. We'll go back to the app, go up to the 2-player game logic. And then right here, let's say on enemy ready, we'll say socket.on enemy ready. And then we have a number being passed to us. Arrow function, we'll say enemy ready equals true. Did I spell that correctly at the top? It didn't pop up. Yeah, I spelled it wrong. Enemy. Oh, enemy. There we go. Enemy ready. And then come back down here. Enemy ready is true. Okay. And then we're going to say player ready. Pass it the number. And then if ready, we're going to play game multi and pass in our socket. Okay, so what we're doing here, when we receive the message that the enemy is ready, we're going to set our local variable enemy ready to true so that we can track that. And then we're going to pass that player's number through our player ready. Remember that the player ready, function, how did I misspell that? Okay, so remember that player ready is basically just setting our ready span square from red to green. So the other player's ready status is going to change when we pass it through here, right? And if we go back up, then if we are ready, then start the play multi-game and pass the socket. So we're going to be calling this play multi-game several times in several different places. Basically, every time an event happens, we want to pass through this and have it do different things. So let's go back into this function now. We're going to add a little bit more to it. So after this, we're going to say if enemy ready. Then we'll say if the current player equals user, then turn display.inner HTML is going to equal your go. And then if current player equals enemy, then turn display.inner HTML is going to equal enemies go. Oops, I need to use double quotes on this one. All right, so we just pass into this so that we can keep track of whose go it is. What if we are ready before the second player even connects? How do they know that we're ready? So we need to add one more check into our code. So as soon as we connect, we're going to say, are there any other players here and are they ready? So we can just say, get other player status. We'll say socket.emit check players. So we're asking the server to check to see if there's any other players and what their status is. So on the server, we'll say check player connections, and then we'll say socket.on check players. And then arrow function. So we'll create a const called players. We'll make that equal to an empty array. And then for const I in connections. So we're going to loop through those connections again. And we'll say connections I. We'll check to see if it is null. We're going to use a ternary operator. So if it is null, then we're going to say players.push. We're going to push an object into it, connected false, and ready false. And then after that, we're going to say if it is not null, then players dot push, another object. We'll say connected is true, and ready is going to be connections I, right? And then after that, we will socket.emit. So we're going to speak directly back to the socket that asked us, and we're going to say check players and send it players. Okay, so we'll go run through this real quick. We're looping through our connections. If the particular connection is null, then we're going to push into our players array connection is false, right? So if it's null, that means no one is connected. And of course, no one is ready. And then if it is not null, that means there is a connection. So we're going to push into their connected true. And then we're going to get our ready status from the actual connection. So in the connection, we're just keeping track of true or false. So if it's false, then it's not ready. If it's true, then it is ready. And then we're going to emit that back to the socket that asked for it. So let's save that. And now, of course, we have to go back to our app.js and listen for that. So let's go right here and we'll say check player status. We'll say socket.on check players. And then we're being given an array of objects called players. Arrow function on that. Then we'll say players dot for each. We'll loop through these and we're going to pull out the player and the index. And then we'll have an arrow function. We're going to say if player dot connected, if the player is connected, then player connected or disconnected I. We're going to call that function player connected or disconnected, passing the index of that player. So that's going to change the visual status of whether the player has connected or not. And then we're also going to say if player ready, so if that's true, then we'll say player ready, pass it in the index, and then if the index is not equal to player number, so if it's not us, then we'll say enemy ready equals true. All right, so let's test that out now. Everything should be working. Let's open up the console. All right, they're already connected, so let's go back in here. We need to refresh, so we should see a disconnect and another disconnect. And now we should see a connect, player 0 connected, which is actually player 1. And now we're getting our green indicator because we are player 1 and player 1 is bold now. So we can see which player we are. And now we'll go here and we'll connect. So now player 2 is connected and is green. And we automatically got player 1 as green because we did that check connection or that check players. So now if we go back in here to player 1, we can also see that player 2 is connected. And let's go ahead and place our ships. All right, and then let's say that we are ready. So we'll set start game. So now it shows that we're ready. When we go to player 2, it also shows that we're ready, that player 1 is ready. Let's place the ships here. All right, and we'll say that player 2 is ready. There we go. Now we're ready across the board. Now we need to start firing some missiles. All right, so let's go back into here. Let's close the console. All right, so back in our multiplayer function, let's go down a bit. We've got our event listener for our start button. Let's add another event listener here. We're going to say setup event listener for firing. All right, so we're going to say computer, I think it's computer squares. Let me go back up to the top. Computer squares. Yeah, let's go back down. Computer squares dot for each. And then we're going to have our square, and then an arrow function. So we'll say square, dot add event listener, and then click. And we'll have an arrow function. We'll say if the current player equals user, so if it's us and we are ready and the enemy is ready, then we'll say shot fired is going to equal square.dataset.id. And then we're going to socket.emit fire and then pass it shot fired. All right, so if we go back to dataset, do a find on dataset, go down here. So when we're creating our board, we're adding to our board a dataset ID. So every square on our board has a number, and we want to pass that number to the server, which is then going to pass it to the other player, who can then identify whether we got a hit or a miss. So now let's go to the server, and then let's add the listen for that. So we'll say on fire received. We'll say socket.onFire. We received an ID, and we're going to arrow function, and let's first console log shot fired from player index, and then just after that, we'll pass in the ID. We'll log two things there. Then let's say emit the move to the other player. We'll say socket.broadcast.emit fire and the ID. All right, so let's save that. And now, of course, we need to listen for the fire on the client side. So we emitted fire to the server. The server is then emitting fire to the other client. So we need to say on fire received. We'll say socket.on fire ID arrow function. We currently have a function called computer go. I think we're going to rename that to enemy go. And then we're going to pass it the ID. And then we have const square is going to equal the user squares and then ID. And then socket.emit, we have to send back a fire reply. We'll go through all of this in just a second. Square, we're going to send it the square.classlist. And then after that, we're going to go back through our play game multi and pass it the socket. Okay, so let's go through this again. We have sent our fire to the server. The server is then sending it back to the other client, which is going to receive it here. And we're going to pass it to this enemy go ID. We'll get to that in just a second. We're going to get the square. So in our user squares, that's the blue box here. So in our user squares, we want to figure out, did we get a hit or a miss? So we're going to reply with the class list of our user square. So what we're interested in is back here, these squares are going to have the classes of taken and the ship type. So we're going to send those classes back to the server, which is then going to send those back to the other player. And then we're going to run through our play game multi, which is going to change whose go it is. All right, so let's go ahead and go to this enemy go, which is actually computer go. Let's see, computer go right here, and then here and here. Okay, so let's just, because it may be the computer, it may be another person, just to better identify this, we're going to change this F2. We're going to say enemy go. All right, so that changed it everywhere. And then we're going to actually be passing into this a square. But we need to make sure that this works for single player and multiplayer. So what we're going to do, instead of getting this random every single time, we're going to get rid of the let here because we have square here. We're going to change random to square. And then before that, we're going to get rid of the let. And we're going to say if the game mode equals single player, then we're going to set the square to this random number. In single player mode, we won't be passing a square. So this is going to be undefined. And so if the game mode is single player, then we're going to define it by giving it a random number. If we're in multiplayer mode, then this square will be defined and we can continue on. Okay, and then the only other thing that we need to change, of course, these are all CPU. We could change that to enemy to be more specific, but that's just fine. We'll leave all of that. And then we only want to call enemy go again if we're in single player mode. So we're going to change this to an else if, and then we'll do game mode equals single player. Then we want to call enemy go. So what happens here is that, let's say that the computer randomly picks the same square twice. Well, we want to be fair, and if it picks the same square twice, we're going to let it go again. All right, but we don't want to do that in multiplayer mode. Okay, so then we had random before. Now we need to change all of these random to square. Let's copy that. Random, Control D to select all of these, and then paste. Now those are all square. So now what it's doing is it's checking to see if the square contains the class of boom. And if it doesn't, then it's going to add the class of boom. And then if it has a class of destroyer, submarine, cruiser, it's going to tally up those points basically. And then we're going to pass it to the check for wins, which we'll get to a little bit later. And then it's going to set the current player to the user and then enter HTML to your go. So now we need to let the other player know if they got a hit or miss. So we'll go back to our server, and then here we'll say on fire reply. We'll say socket.on fire reply. And then we have our square arrow function. Let's just console log the square. And then we'll say forward the reply to the other player. We'll say socket.broadcast.emit fire reply and pass it the square. All right, we'll save that, go back into our app.js, and we need to listen for that fire reply. So back up here, we are emitting our fire right there, and then we're receiving a fire on the other side, and we're sending a fire reply. So now we need to say on receiving fire reply, so on fire reply received, we'll say socket.on fire reply, and then we're being passed a class list. That was the square, basically the contents of the square that we're being passed. And so now in here, we're going to reveal square and pass it the class list. And then we're going to again go through our play game multi and pass it in our socket. And that's going to switch whose go it is to the next player. So now we're going to have to make some changes to this reveal square. So let's go down to the reveal square. So right now in single player mode, we're using reveal square and we're passing it the entire square. But actually what we need to pass it is the class list. So we'll say class list. And then up here, instead of just square, it's going to be square.classList. Now we're going to get a couple of variables here. We're going to say const. We're just going to call this enemy square equals, I think it's called computer grid. computer grid dot query selector. And then we want to get a div with the data ID that equals shot fired. And then another const of object, which is going to equal object.values. And then we're going to pass in our class list. So we are on our computer grid. We're going to look for the div with the ID, the data ID of shot fired. Now remember, when we clicked on the grid, we got an ID and we passed that into shot fired. Now we're being given a reply back so that we can then be told whether we got a hit or a miss. And then we're turning our class list into an object so that we can more easily search through it. So then we're going to say if, instead of square, we're going to be looking in the enemy square this time. So if the enemy square does not contain boom, we're also going to add on to this current player is equal to user and not is game over. So the game is not over. Then we're going to say if instead of square, we're going to change all of these from square to object. So let's select all of these, all of this changes to object. So object.contains destroyer, submarine, cruiser, battleship, carrier. Then we're going to tally up those points. And then if object contains taken, then we're going to say enemy square. So these two are going to change to enemy square.classlist.add either boom or miss. Then we're going to check for wins. And then we're going to set the current player is equal to computer. Let's change this to enemy. And then instead of play game single, we need to if game mode equals single player, then play game single. All right, so we changed this to enemy. So I think we need to actually come up here. And if current player is enemy, let's change that there as well. All right, so let's give that a try now. Let's pull up our console and keep track of what's going on. And we'll pull up our app and let's refresh both of these. So we should get 2 disconnects. And then we'll get a connect and another connect. And then let's place some ships. All right, and then we'll go say that we're ready. So player 2 is connected and ready. And then player 1. And we'll say we're ready. All right, so both are ready. And it says, so this is player 1, it says your go. Player 1 is always going to go first. On player 2, it says enemies go. All right, so if I'm on player 2, I can't click. It's not going to do anything if I click in here. All right, so now on player 1, I'm just going to click a random square. And we got shot fired from player 0. And the square was 22. And then we got 0 and boom. And then we got some kind of an error here. Object that contains not a function 346. All right, so app 346. Okay, I see what I did. So on the object, we can't use contains. That's not proper. Change contains to includes. And then that should work. Make sure I didn't miss anything else here. Okay, let's save that and let's try again. Go back to our app. Let's refresh both of these. All right, and let's connect and let's place our ships. All right, and we'll say player 1's ready. Or that's player 2. Or no, that's player 1, but I'm on this. Okay. All right, let's move that back down. Play that. Let's place our ships. All right, and then we'll say that we're ready. All right, so enemies go. We need to go over to this tab and we'll click, and there we go. All right, so we got boom, but we didn't get a hit, right? So now it's the enemies go. We'll go over here, and if I click right there, looks like we got a hit. So over here, let's go back. We can see these are the classes that we got: taken, and we got destroyer, and then boom. Of course, boom was added because boom is added to each one. All right, so now that's working. Let's go back into the app. So enemies go, let's go back over here, click a random one, go back here, and if I click this one, we can see that we sunk the computers, and it says computers destroyer. We might want to change the verbiage there. All right, so let's go back in here, and that's in the check for wins. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's close the terminal. Let's go back to our server. One more thing that I want to add here is at the very bottom, I want to add a timeout. So I'm going to say timeout connection. So we'll say set timeout. I'm going to set that to 600,000, which is actually 10 minutes. So 10-minute limit per player. So I want to give everyone a chance to play. I don't want someone to just hog the server all the time. So we're going to give each player a 10-minute limit. All right. So we'll say on this timeout, we're going to say connections, and then pass in the player index. We're going to make it null. And then we're going to socket.emit timeout. And then we're going to socket.disconnect. All right. So after 10 minutes, we're going to disconnect the socket, and we're going to send a message letting it know that it's been disconnected. So we need to go back into our app.js, and let's go up to our sockets, and right here, and we'll say on timeout socket.on timeout arrow function. And we'll just do an info display.inner HTML. It's going to equal you have reached the 10-minute limit. Oh, I'm missing a bracket there. Okay, so now let's go into our check for wins function. I think that's right here. Each time a player goes, we go through this check for wins function, which then tallies up our points and checks to see if we've sunk all of the ships or if the other player has sunk all of the ships. All right, so you sunk the computer's destroyer. I think we're just going to change this to say, you know what we could do? Let's do this. We'll say let enemy equal computer. And then we'll just say if game mode equals multiplayer, then we'll say enemy equals enemy. All right, and then in here, let's just change all of these. Control D to keep selecting multiple. We're going to change these to backticks. And then computers, select all of those. Actually, these aren't all supposed to say you sunk. All right, so let's, we'll fix that as well. Okay, so we will do this and we'll say enemy, whatever that might be. And then we'll say, put the S on the end, because I think it said computers and enemies. Let's just do that. All right, so you sunk the enemy's submarine, but destroyer. But right here, I think this is supposed to say the enemy sunk your slight little fix here. So we'll just change this to enemy and then sunk your, and then whatever these might be. Let's just change the case on these. And then we go down here, you win, or we could use enemy again. We could go down here and we could say enemy. Oh, we need to put that into a backticks. All right, well, we're going to say enemy dot to uppercase. It's going to either say computer wins or enemy wins. All right, and then we're calling game over, which is going to set is game over to true and remove that event listener. All right, so that should be everything as far as this goes. Let's test everything out and make sure. All right, so let's pull up our console. Let's pull up our app. We'll refresh everything. Everyone is disconnected. All right, so let's go over here. We're going to start player 1. And let's place all of our ships. I'm going to make it easy to win. And I'll place one random. Okay, and we'll say start game. And then we'll go over to this one, multiplayer. All right, start game. So everyone is ready now. Let's just connect a third one just so that we can, I don't think we ever tested that out. So let's connect a third and then let's hit multiplayer and we can see -1 has connected and it says, sorry, the server is full. All right, so that works. And let's go back to these guys. All right, so it's your go. I know I placed them all up around there. So let's just quickly go through here. So enemies go, your go, enemies go. Let's just keep going. All right, I think this should be the winning shot. There we go. You win. And then if we go over here, enemy wins. All right, so everything on the multiplayer side is working. Let's refresh. And then let's just verify that everything on the single player is still working. All right, so if I hit single player, there we go. Let's pull up some ships here. And then start game. It says your go. Oh, we're getting an issue here. All right, app.js 350. Cannot read property class list of null. 350. All right, let's figure this one out. All right, enemy square, class list, computer grid, query selector, shot fired. Oh, I'm not keeping track of shot fired. Possibly. Let's see. Okay, so that would be coming from the single player here. We do need to keep track of the shots fired in here as well. So if game that turn computer squares dot for each, add event listener, reveal square. Okay. So right in here, we forgot to add shot fired is going to equal square.dataset.id. We have to set that. All right, so let's save that. Let's go back to our app, refresh, start a single player game. Let's put our ships on the board, start the game. Now it's working. Let's make sure we can win. And it's working. All right, so now we just need to deploy this. Okay, so I'm going to commit these changes to Ania's GitHub repo, and then we're going to deploy this to Heroku. All right, so now on Heroku, just sign up for a free account and then create a new app. So the first thing that we'll do is just name it. So say Battleship dash codeSTACKr. How about that? All right, and then region is United States, create the app. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to use GitHub. We're going to pull from our repo here. And I have a Battleships repo, so we're going to connect to that. And then we're going to pull from the master branch, and then click deploy branch. It's going to run through the build process, and so this might take a few minutes. All right, so our app is successfully deployed. So now if I hit view, there we go. There's our app. And so I could open this up into two browsers here, just like we did before. We'll start a multiplayer on this one. That's player 1. And then on this one, player 2. And we can see that player 1 is connected as well. And then we can place all of our ships. And we'll say start game on player 1. Now player 1's ready. And we can see that player 1 is ready on player 2's. Place all of player 2's ships. And we can start game. And now it says enemies go, because we're on player 2. Go back to player 1, and we can start firing. And then we'll go back to this one. And you get the point. It's working. All right, so now that we got the multiplayer logic all worked out and we got it deployed, let's send this off to Kyle at Web Dev Simplified so that he can make it look awesome. Be sure to watch the final video on his channel. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.